As Lee Cronin likes visceral body horror stuff so much, he should definitely call his next film Berg, because then it would be Lee Cronin's Berg. Hi, welcome to Film Fiend. My name is Seb, and today I'm reviewing Lee Cronin's The Mummy. So, Lee Cronin's The Mummy is written and directed by, you guessed it, Lee Cronin. Obviously, much has been said about the title, so I won't waste loads of time going on about it, but it is a bit odd and pointless. I mean, it is literally called Lee Cronin's The Mummy. That's the actual title of the film. If you type in The Mummy on Letterboxd, it doesn't come up. They obviously wanted to call it The Mummy so bad that they had to come up with a way to differentiate it from the Brendan Fraser films. But instead of just acquiescing to compromise, the studio instead had an absolute brainwave and decided to include the director's name in the title, rather than just calling it The Sarcophagus or something. Anyway, other than the obvious reasons that it's not an optimal title, having the director's name as part of the film's title usually suggests some things. Like, for example, that people are going to know what they are in for with this film because the director is renowned for a particular trademarked style, like, for example, John Carpenter's The Thing. But of course, Cronin only had 2 films to his name before this, and only one is widely known. I'm referring to Evil Dead Rise. So the inclusion of his name in the title is obviously not for that reason. But as well as this implied renowned style, the use of a director's name in this way could also suggest that the film is, in itself, some way iconic or seminal, which, to be brutally honest, this is definitely not. It's messy and silly and derivative, and I kind of liked it. The plot is really simple, there's nothing novel going on in that regard. Child goes missing and then is subsequently found, but she's now a mummy, and despite this her family take her home, and needless to say it doesn't exactly go well. For me, this film is at its best when it's being a gross out popcorn horror movie with gory squirm inducing practical effects, diabolical dialogue and unabashedly over the top horror sequences. And it's at its worst when it devolves into a more formulaic studio horror movie with a fairly predictable structure and one-dimensional characters. However, in my opinion, it is much better than your average studio horror film, although it does take itself a little too seriously at times, instead of just sticking to what it's good at. A phrase that came to mind for me whilst I was watching it was that it's like a Blumhouse film that wants to be an A24 film, but never quite achieves it. It's most definitely derivative, with plenty of visual cues taken from other better horror films like The Exorcist and The Omen. It is overly long as well. It definitely doesn't need to be over 2 hours, and at times it's unfocused. However, I do think that its all over the place quality kind of adds to the unhinged nature of the film, and I appreciate its audacity to throw a lot of goop at the wall and see what sticks, especially in the last act where it goes absolutely insane. The positives for me were that I really liked the Egyptian vibes. It's not a setting that you see that often in films, so it's cool to see it in a mainstream film again. Also, they somehow managed to carry that Egyptian atmosphere and aesthetic over when it switches to an American setting, which was a good idea, making the ambience feel consistent throughout. It's also really well shot, although admittedly the split diopter shots are way overused, but to be fair, they are really cool. So the cinematography is definitely not bog standard studio horror style. They obviously wanted to achieve a tactile look, so the visuals are something that sets this film apart in that regard. Also, it has very effective sound design, which we all know is integral to a good horror film, especially one with a lot of goopy, visceral practical effects. And there's a lot of disgusting and horrific sequences in this film, with some particularly repugnant moments, some of which made me physically wince. I also appreciate that it has a better and more intriguing mystery than most studio horrors. Cronin does manage to sidestep the typical second act exposition dump in favour of a more creative plot reveal, which is nice because we all know and have had to sit through that lacklustre scene in a lot of studio horrors where the protagonist finds out some information that's fairly oblique, but there's someone who is loosely connected to the story who might know more, usually an older person in a nursing home or something, and then the protagonist goes and finds them, and that's when we get a big exposition dump that explains the mystery in like 30 seconds. But here, the reveal, although admittedly telegraphed, is at least a little more interesting and visually compelling, instead of coming in the form of an uninspired exposition dump. Not that I'm saying it's the greatest reveal ever or anything, it's still just fine, but it's definitely more unique than what happens in most studio horror movies. And for me, in general, this film does do enough to set itself apart from the more generic horror movies that are seemingly churned out by the dozen these days. So overall, it's just a fun popcorn horror flick that might not completely circumvent all the pitfalls of a generic studio horror movie, but it definitely achieves what it sets out to do, which is be a crazy, gross out viscera fest, and it excels in that regard. So you could do a lot worse. So that was my review of Lee Cronin's The Mummy. Thanks so much for watching. If you made it all the way through, you're a legend. So thanks so much, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.